So I'm going to hand over to the session moderator, Nara Monkam. Nara is a tax expert with UNDP, and she's also an associate professor of public economics at the University of Pretoria. Over to you, Nara.
Yes, it's working. Thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome to everyone to this last session of the day, where we will be discussing the issue of multilateral approaches to tax and SDGs. And to assist us in unpacking the discussion, we have our three speakers. We have Mauricio Cárdenas, who is the director of the Master of Public Administration in Global Leadership at the Columbia University. We have Mr. Djamel Ghrib, who is the Director of Economic Development, Integration and Trade at the African Union Commission. And online, we have Mrs. Mary Baine, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the African Tax Administration Forum. So without further ado, we basically, most of the sessions of today have given a background to our session today. So especially session 2 and session 3, the presentations that were discussed there. So we've seen that taxation and fiscal policies basically play a big role in development finance, development financing. But they're not just used to promote development, sustainable growth strategies, but they also encourage, as we saw, behavioral changes contributing to desired outcome, including issues of environmental, health, gender equality, and many other aspects of sustainable development goals. We also seen that the complexity of taxation has also increased with the deepening of the digitalization of the economy, which has basically made it possible for companies to do business without necessarily having a physical presence, which again has basically removed the legislative basis for taxation. And also the COVID crisis has further accelerated the digitalization of the economy, making taxation and the collection of revenue even more complicated. And based on the statistics we saw in session 3, we've seen that multilateral tax avoidance cost countries an estimated $500 billion USD per year, with the largest share of the losses occurring in low and middle income countries. For example, multinational enterprise tax avoidance may cost as much as 5 to 8% of GDP in those countries annually, like countries like Guyana, Chad, Guinea, Zambia, and Pakistan, compared to 0.6 to 1% of GDP only, I mean, not only, but GDP in annual losses for higher income countries. We also seen that in this context of globalized economic globalization, international tax cooperation can be very important for domestic resource mobilization for developed and developing countries alike. And in that regard, work has been done globally already to actually reform the global tax architecture, to actually reflect these changes of reality. The work done by the UN Tax Committee, the OECD G20 BEPS process, as well as the inclusive framework two-pillar solutions that we discussed earlier. So in that context, we need to discuss basically what are the multilateral approaches. Is this still important? I mean, how important it is actually in the context where we see tendency towards unilateralism and actually fragmentation. So I will start first with you, Mauricio, if you'll allow me. So what is the significance of the multilateralism in the global governance systems, and how do we apply that to taxation and SDGs, again, in this context where unilateralism and fragmentation appear to be, seem to be appealing, especially when we've seen that the current global tax architecture seems to be unfit for purpose in some cases. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Nara. Thanks to UNDP for the very kind invitation. I've enjoyed very much this day. It's been very enlightening, and there have been lots of good ideas. And I think I'm just going to elaborate on some of the things that have already been mentioned. Let me start by saying that when I first think about the multilateral approaches, I think what first comes to mind in my case is that now we're living in what seems a different world, a world where there are many, many crises at the same time, that these crises do not seem to be isolated, they don't seem to be extreme tail risk events, they're becoming more and more common. And they are not just multi-dimensional, interdependent, but they're truly global. And we seem to be in this state of permanent emergency. The pandemic was one example, but by no means the only example. If a new pandemic were to hit us, we would not be better prepared than we were in early 2020. So all this is saying that really the state of the world in which we live now requires a different type of arrangement. We need to deal with this global crisis in a different way. And essentially, this new generation of crisis requires global public goods. And I think the first item in the agenda for the multilateral approach to taxation and the SDGs, in my view of things, should be the ability to develop and provide these global public goods. Take the example of pandemic preparedness. Pandemic preparedness, by many estimates, requires at least $10 billion per year. That's the estimate we made in the independent panel for pandemic preparedness that was convened by the WHO. Now, with a lot of effort, and I think acknowledging the many countries that have actually provided funds, there is a pandemic fund that's sitting in the World Bank. The US is an important supporter, but not just advanced economies like Germany. Also, Indonesia, for example, is providing support to the pandemic fund. But it's only $1.5 billion. So it's really small relative to the needs. And when we ask ourselves, why is it that we're going on the approach, to use the word that Mariana Mazzucato mentioned this morning, the patchy approach, like patches. We're trying to fix the issue of energy. We're trying to fix the issue of hunger. We're trying to fix the issue of climate. It's because we don't really have collective action that allows us to provide these global public goods. So first item, in my view, is make sure that we design a multilateral system that is able to fund these global public goods. The multilateral system that we have was created for something else. Was created to help countries provide their own domestic public goods. But many of these crises are related, the current crises are related to the need of something different, creating the ability to fund these global public goods. That's, to me, item number one. Take an example. Take the example of the climate crisis. I just finished a paper with a student here at CIPA trying to estimate the cost of achieving the NDCs. And we do that with some detail for the countries of Latin America. And essentially, this is the best strategy in order to get there, in order to reduce emissions by 30, 40, 50% by the end of this decade. Each country has its own NDC, and for each country, the mix of interventions to get there is different. Many countries in Latin America, by the way, rely heavily on the need to prevent deforestation. But the interesting point here is that this is very costly. In countries like my own, Colombia, this can cost up to 13% of GDP per year just to achieve the NDCs, not necessarily to get to net zero. And if you compare that to the US or the European Union, this is significantly more. And the reason is that these are countries that are growing faster, therefore are demanding more energy. Economies in Latin America, they have a lower GDP. So that this means that as a share of GDP, the effort is greater. So if we just depend on the ability of these economies to raise 10% of GDP to achieve one goal, which is the NDCs, and let's not talk about the rest of the SDGs, this is not going to be viable. That's why we need the international cooperation. And I think if we think of carbon taxes as something that countries on their own need to do, we're not going to get there. We're not going to get to the, say, $40, $50 per ton of CO2. In Colombia, to a large extent promoted, and I was very well kind of like motivated by Professor Stiglitz about the need of adopting carbon taxation. We did that in a 2016 tax reform. And with a great effort, we were able to introduce a $5 per ton tax, which is far from where we need to be if we really want to achieve the NDC. So I think we need to move into the more global cooperation and coordination type of dimension to make sure that this happens. And here I bring an idea that I listened a month ago from Raghu Rajan, who gave a lecture at the annual meetings of the IMF and promoted this interesting idea, which is instead of asking all countries to fix their own independent, autonomous carbon tax, maybe we can think about the global carbon tax, and a global carbon tax that essentially makes countries that emit less than the world average, say the world average is 4.5 tons of CO2 per capita. If you emit more, you pay a contribution. If you emit less than the average, you receive a compensation. And if we do this, say, with a $10 per ton CO2, you'll raise $100 billion. But some countries, say Colombia, will be kind of like not a contributor, not a recipient, but many countries will be receiving from this global fund, and they'll be able to finance their own energy and climate transition. So I think this is a good idea. These are the types of solutions that I think we need. Now, yes, collective action is, global collective action is very important. There are multiple fronts. I mean, we talk about climate, we talk about health, but there is also the issue of hunger, there is also the issue of energy. But at the end of the day, we need domestic resource mobilization. I mean, this is indispensable. We need to strengthen the tax effort at the national level. And I'm a firm believer that without fiscal state capacity, there's no development. And you are here representing many of the Ministries of Finance, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, tax administrators, and yes, we can have this conversation about global coordination, but at the end of the day, the domestic effort is formidable. And I think we really want to build societies that are not just civilized, as it says in the IRS building here in the US, but societies that are more inclusive and sustainable. We need to do this. So there are many ways in which we can develop these resources at the domestic level. Certainly, global cooperation is going to be very helpful. In the experience of Colombia, the country I come from, the mechanisms that allowed us to exchange our information, the automatic exchange of information, has helped Colombia significantly in terms of reducing tax evasion. The fact that tax evasion was converted into a crime, which was not before, that's also very important. The idea of fighting the use of tax havens for Colombia is fundamental, that Panama started disclosing and exchanging information with us. All those things are part of the global cooperation. So we need more cooperation, we need less competition. But we also need to do things we need to correct things that we were doing wrong. Last year I served on the panel that made a comprehensive review of the Doing Business report for the World Bank. When I was finance minister, I suffered the Doing Business report because anytime we wanted to do the tax reform, someone will basically raise his or her hand and say, we're going to lose competitiveness, and we're going to look bad in the rankings of the Doing Business. In this report that we produced last year, right before the Doing Business was terminated, we said, well, the first thing is stop ranking countries according to the total tax contribution rates, the TTCRs. That's not a good practice. And don't compare countries just in terms of what the statutory rate is, because you need to make sure that, that they're public goods. I mean, competitiveness requires public goods. So I think this is part of the overhaul that the World Bank is doing. I think stopping practices like this is very important because they just send the wrong signals. Now, on domestic resource mobilization, I want to end by sharing two ideas and of things that can be done, I think can be implemented relatively easily, and to me are part of what the global cooperation about taxes and the role of multilaterals. It's also kind of like using good practices, good examples of things that have worked in some countries so that others can learn from. The idea of the UNDP's tax inspectors without borders, I think is a very good idea in terms of sharing these practices. Today, and I mentioned this because today we posted this op-ed that I wrote with a former colleague who's finance minister in the Philippines, and we more or less about the same time, we increased very significantly taxes for health. So raising taxes on tobacco, on sugar drinks, we did that also on alcohol in the case of Colombia, has been very productive. It's a win-win. I'll connect this with a comment that Professor Stiglitz mentioned earlier on today, which is taxes can also help you with efficiency. And in this case, it's amazing what you can do in terms of reducing the incidence of non-communicable diseases. In Colombia, we tripled the taxes on tobacco and we reduced consumption, and yet there was an increase in revenues that was actually earmarked for the health sector. So these are good practices. These are things that can be done, can be implementable, and this just needs a lot of good information and the ability to fight these lobbies that are very strong against this type of taxation. And finally, I'll end with this. Another way of enhancing efficiency is by, and equity at the same time, is by reducing informality. In many of our countries, in developing countries, we rely on taxes on the payroll because that was an easy target. It was an easy tax base to collect taxes from. But it produced very negative effects, especially by increasing informality. So in 2012, we introduced in Colombia a tax bill that cut payroll taxes, taxes on labor, and replaced them for taxes on capital, corporate income taxes. And the effect was just fantastic in terms of the reduction of informality. And these are the type of transformations that you can do, not just to raise revenues, but also to reduce inefficiencies, and in this case in particular also sources of inequality. So there are good examples and good practices of things that can be done. This should be part of the multilateral conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. I just wanted to inform the participants that they please take note of your questions, and you are welcome to ask your questions in English, French, as well as even Russian or Arabic. So you are welcome. So please don't hesitate to write down your questions. So the next question will go to Mr. Djamel. Mauricio just mentioned that in this globalized world, we need that a global collective action in order to fund global public goods. So, but that should start at the regional level. I imagine. So in the context of the African Union tax strategy for Africa, what is the strategy actually to build that collective, regional collective tax architecture actually at a regional level based on principles such as consultation, inclusion, and solidarity, and ensuring that no country is left behind? Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you. Allow me just to start by some numbers. First, the first number that comes, we have an Agenda 2063, which was adopted by the African heads of state, where we talk about 70% to be mobilized at the domestic level. So this is something very important, and which is amounting to around 200 billion US dollar annually to be really collected. But at the same time, we found that in terms of IFFs, when it comes to illicit financial flows, the latest number we do have is 90 billion US dollar are going out of the continent illegally. Well, through a legal system, but it's illegally done. And when we go through whatever was set up as an OECD and framework, G20 framework, we found that when I go back to this exchange of information, the automated one, Africa was able just within 5 last year just to bring back 1.2 billion US dollar, which is really very, very small amount compared to the 80 billion US dollar, which goes on an annual basis. So this is even, I think, the number, even I think it's a little bit not the realistic one. We feel that the number is much more higher than that one. So just to give some numbers, for me it's very important to do. So what, at the regional level, what are we trying to do? What we are trying to do is come up with a strategy, and we have been able to come up with a tax strategy at the EU, which was endorsed in July 2022 in Lusaka. This is one. We have partnered with our colleague from ATAF. So ATAF stands for the African Tax Administration Forum. So they have presented a common position on what we call the African tax strategy, which was endorsed by the ministers, and now it's going to the highest level, the heads of state. What we have been able to do is to come up with a coordination, a good financial governance coordination mechanism, which brings really ATAF. We have the CABRI, Collaborative African Budget Reform Initiative, the African Organization of Supreme Audit Institution, and the African Organization of English-Speaking Supreme Audit Institution, AFROSAI and AFROS-E, the African Organization of the Public Account Committee, AFROPAC, with the Office of the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa, CODA, and the AU-UNECA, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, high-level panel on illicit financial flow. So all these partners, we are bringing all of them. We have set up a coordination mechanism, and we are trying really to come up with some common, we are trying really to map first our mandate. We are trying really to come up with the synergized really plan of action that really will be tackling at different levels, though this issue of tax evasion, illicit financial flow, if you want to put it in a verse. So this is just to tell you what is happening now. When I look to what is happening at the global level, we found there are many, many initiatives, and this is something that I would like really to bring again to this audience. I see many Africans sitting here. There are many. So one of them is the EU fifth anti-money laundering directives. We have the Financial Action Task Force, G7. We have the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. We have the Beneficial Ownership Database, Data Standards. We have the G20, of course, the OECD Inclusive Forum. So all of them, they were designed outside Africa, and we feel sometimes we were not part of those framework, at least at the initial stage. And what we are trying to do through the latest, I think this is an important, again, moment, what has happened last week when it was adopted, again, what we call the African proposal to set up a promotion of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation for the United Nations. We are trying to bring some of the frameworks which were developed outside within a general, what we call UN tax convention. We are not excluding. I'm saying it's very important. We are not excluding none of the framework, existing one. What we are trying is to bring everything under the same umbrella, UN. Why UN? Because we feel one country is one voice. I think we have our voice to be, we need to come, and we will be, of course, trying to develop and to come up with a single position through the UN, of course, with other developing countries. Why the UN is important for us? The UN is important because we found that even with what we are trying to do and with all our goodwill in being part of all those frameworks around the world, we found that we are still having, and it's still not, there is no full buy-in by the member states. This is one. There is an issue really of lack of information between both sides. And we found that finally the one who is really benefiting from all those frameworks is the countries from the developed countries, for the developed, those who are really leading the OECD. And we are saying now, and this is again, I'm voicing out the African Union Commission, that we are expecting to have another rounds of battles at the UN, because the OECD was really something which were imposed. I'm not saying this is wrong, it is good, it has advantages, but we found it's still really putting a lot of kind of, how can I say, political pressure on the countries in order to release the information that finally is benefiting to the OECD, especially those leading countries, not to the African. And I can take one good example is, I think we have a good example about Tunisia, which was really recently mentioned as a good example that they were able to identify in terms of IFFs, illicit financial flows, $22 million. But does it mean this is enough? It's still the number is very low. And we know from the other side, the information that was gathered from Tunisia to the OECD will be having more in terms of collecting, in terms of tax collection at the EU, at the OECD side, at the OECD level. So for me, the UN is coming at the right time, this time. And what I'm trying just to allude here, that we need more collaboration. We need really that all the good intention comes around one table. We are taking into account what is happening on the ground. We are taking many of the shortcomings. But for me, something which is very important even to mention now, that whatever we are trying to implement, it should not bounce back on the African side image. I'll try to make it very clear. It's not because we are trying to do our level best to comply with all the framework that it makes us, or it put us in a very, how can I say, very weak position in front of the donors. It's not because we are trying to open our books that we should be targeted, or the country should put their finger or target us as are corrupted. We are not. We know that issue we are having in terms of lack of financial and political governance. We do recognize, but at the same time, the OECD and the nation, they need to understand we are doing a great effort in terms of tax collection. We are doing a lot, and we know the $80 billion, where are they sitting? They are not sitting in Africa. They are sitting outside Africa. And when we start really to dig and analyze, we found the countries that are even very, how can I say, developed country in terms of excellent good governance and the political and good economic governance. Some of them were even listed in Thabo Mbeki report. So for me, it's when we try to bring all the coalition, we are trying to bring the international community, we need to one-to-one, face-to-face recognize that there is an issue, but there is a shared responsibility, and there is a shared responsibility between the African side and, of course, the rest of the world. But the blame should not be put on the African side only. And this is very important, and this is what we are trying really to voice as African Union Commission through all whatever. The last but not least, we found that since the morning, no one has mentioned G20. And I feel G20 is something that really it needs to be, we need to bring it back and to put it here. Why G20? Because the G20, whatever we are listening, whatever we are trying really to get it as an information through this very interesting dialogue, the G20 has another direction. And I have attended all their really this discussion, and I can tell you something which really doesn't, it's not even linked to whatever we are hearing here. Something else, there is another things there that they are deciding and they are imposing. Sometimes it's good, sometimes I would say about Africa, I'm not saying for the rest of the world. I have to confess some of the decisions were very, very important for us, but sometimes we feel that the G20 is taking decision by listening to the 19 countries in the EU, where we have one single country, is South Africa, sitting there. So for me, it's very important really to bring back that that Africa it's an important market, it's an important continent, but our voice still is lacking there at the G20. And I think it's very important that we bring again, it's not only about OECD. OECD, by the way, they are reporting to the G20. And whatever the G20 takes as a decision, it will be implemented. So for me, it's a big puzzle. Each one has his own, of course, responsibility. What we need is to come up with a good coordination mechanism that really shows about all the goodwill around some good, important, perhaps work stream from that convention, but leading really to have a fair treatment about this issue of illicit financial flow. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Djamel, for your input on basically how to achieve that regional tax architecture at the regional level before going trying to achieve basically the global tax architecture as well. So now we will go to Mary from ATAF, who is online. So we know that for more than 10 years now, Mary, ATAF has played a major role in building tax systems in Africa, as well as also being the voice of Africa on tax issues on the continent. So I would like you to share with us basically what do you think are the benefit of multilateralism that African countries under the umbrella of ATAF actually managed to experience in that journey. So what has been those benefits for African countries through that multilateralism? And we just heard that multilateralism is not perfect. It can be perceived as an obstacle to the realization of national interest, or an encroachment on sovereignty, or as an instrument at the service of great powers. So what do you, what first of all has been ATAF experience in that sense, and what would you suggest to actually mitigate these challenges? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nara, and hello, everyone. I'd also like to start by thanking the UNDP for inviting ATAF. Indeed, for the last 13 years, ATAF has been working with countries to try and build capacity within tax administrations through, policy advice, through capacity building. But as we all know, while even the previous speaker said it, while tax policy and everything that is requisite to collect domestic revenue mobilization rests within the sovereignty of every country, again, this also works within a global context. And so while multilateralism has its own vices, like the previous speakers have said, I mean, it's also a playing field in which countries have to operate. And because of this, ATAF has been working with countries and largely in its mandate as the voice really on tax in Africa largely, and also especially as we try to navigate the standard setting process that then determines how these countries can collect resources from taxation. So multilateralism, I would say, has played an important role in the evolution of ATAF's work on two fronts. Firstly, through the engagement with a diverse membership and a diverse group of people, in terms, as I said, of voicing Africa's needs and Africa's priorities. And then secondly, in terms of implementing those standards once they are set. So for us at ATAF, we find that this has largely led to the evolution of our work, because it has enabled ATAF to unpack some of the more complex concepts that then allow countries to design their policies from a perspective where they understand some of these issues. I can give a couple of examples. The previous speakers also alluded to them: the work of the UN Tax Committee, the work of the Inclusive Framework, and the work that even you as a moderator spoke about under the base erosion and profit shifting. All these projects, and of course, lately the discussion on taxation of the digitalized economy, have all been game-changing and have had an effect on the international tax system. And so for countries to remain relevant and to remain effective in collecting domestic revenue mobilization, it has been important for these countries to be at the table in these discussions. But as ATAF also, we could not have missed the opportunity to support these countries, because it then enables the countries to unpack some of the more complex concepts and then be able to provide like Dr. Ghrib said, to form common positions that then lead into the different decisions. Unfortunately, to date, no, in terms of tax priorities and in terms of the allocation of taxing rights, that hasn't, we can't say we are in an ideal place. We're still very far from that. But still, those discussions could not have happened without there being a multilateral setting. So primarily, policy formation has been a key outcome of this multilateral engagements. Then secondly, in terms of the, again, standard setting, through this multilateral arena, it has been possible for us to come up with an African position, to say this is what works for Africa, this is what works for the countries. While there may be so many considerations and why we have to listen to other ideas, but it is important for us as a continent to articulate what works, what is fit for purpose. And that would not have been possible without, having those having a multilateral setting. So multilateralism in respect to the global discussions on taxation, for instance, of the digital economy, has enabled ATAF to present the position of African countries. And this has, which has really fundamentally improved some of the discussions. Some of these things had never existed before. And as you know, through these discussions and through these engagements at the multilateral level, for instance, a couple of things were able to be adopted. For instance, the adoption of a single global threshold to cover all MNEs. And this also, while we didn't get the outcome that we wanted, but we were able at least to voice that, and it was at least the beginning of a conversation. And for us, we feel that since countries cannot operate as islands and have to depend on global standards, then the first step is the discussion. The discussion is far from being equitable, like Dr. Ghrib said, but at the end of the day, it's important even to have a beginning of that discussion. And in some of the more positive areas, for instance, we were able to come up with with examples that can be used, for instance, in the agricultural sector, when we, in terms of taxation, and to say this is actually some of the work that we are doing, the work that will benefit Africa. So in terms of our experience, ATAF has had the opportunity to observe at the Inclusive Framework of the OECD and also at the UN Tax Committee, and to support the African members, through technical support. So through both organizations over the past 5 years, for instance, we have had the opportunity to contribute a number of things. We have, for instance, contributed about 150 written comments that articulate solutions that we feel are fit for purpose for Africa. we have attended over 70 physical meetings to try and support African countries. We have provided technical guidance and assistance, at both meetings. And we have also been able to provide an African example, especially in transfer pricing guidelines, which was really something that we feel was a big objective, a big achievement, because previously it hadn't been there. So while we have been able to make all these strides at the multilateral engagements, there's still the critical issue of the power dynamics and vested interests and circles of influence that dominate discussions and influence outcomes in some multilateral fora. So inclusivity and consultation become critical because these then will lead to cohesion based on common interests of the diverse stakeholders with varying levels of economic and revenue policy and administration and maturity. So for us at ATAF, we feel that multilateralism, while having its own vices, has also helped, to be able to articulate what is critical and what is fair for Africa. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for this perspective from ATAF. So now, just a last round of questions before, again, I invite the participants to pose their question. And again, please, you are invited to do so in Portuguese, in French, in Arabic, and because interpretation basically is available. So, so now we know that, in October of this year, a draft resolution was put forward by the 54-member African group of nations within the UN General Assembly, and which basically called on members to decide to lay the groundwork for a UN tax convention to basically fight illicit financial flow and corporate tax abuse. And we, a few days ago, the UN General Assembly actually adopted the resolution that calls for developing an international tax cooperation framework or instrument that is developed and agreed upon through a United Nations intergovernmental process. Now, the questions that I will address to all three panelists is this. So now that the resolution has been adopted, in your opinion, and given your experience in your relevant institutions, what should be the next steps towards moving closer to a successful multilateralism in international taxation? And also follow-up questions to that. We know, Mary, for example, that some countries in Africa and in other developing countries have already started implementing some of the pillar solutions. So in that context, how do we provide those countries with a tax policy coherence, given the tools and the work already undertaken by the Inclusive Framework, the UN Tax Committee, as well as now this possibility of international cooperation agreed upon through a UN intergovernmental process. And added to that, you all mentioned the issues of that we have experienced, for example, at the Inclusive Framework. How do we correct those issues going forward? How do we ensure that those same issues are not repeated during this UN Tax Convention? Those power dynamics you mentioned, Mary, those vested interests, how do we ensure that one country, one voice at the UN is implemented, keeping in mind that we know that some of those countries are not able to actually exercise that voice. So how do we move going forward? And I will start the question, with you, Mauricio, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Nara. Look, I think we should basically congratulate ourselves that that resolution was approved. I think it's a very important step. I think that a number of countries will be better represented in the decision-making process by shifting the focus into the UN. I think this is a positive outcome, and I'm certainly, I commend those countries that promoted this. Having said that, I think we have to build on what has been achieved. I would echo what Gabriel Zuckman said in the previous panel, in the sense that there are important advancements that we need to acknowledge. Not just the automatic exchange of information, I think that's a very important. The concept, the second pillar essentially of the inclusive framework, the minimum tax, although 15% tax rate is clearly a very low threshold that we need to make sure that we raise that. But these are important major advancements. I would also echo the point that we need to exchange not just financial information, but I think the point about real estate is a very good point. I think this is potentially a game changer if you have that information about real estate, and that will increase revenues in our countries in a very significant way. So, build on what has been already achieved. How to ensure that this does not slow the process? How to ensure that when we look back, say 2-3 years from now, we say, well, we lost the momentum. I think this requires decisive action. This requires the ability to start a process, well, first to engage in the negotiation of a convention, but also to start the process of what will be the content of that convention. And if we aim for something that is very broad and it's huge in terms of aspirations, that it's going to resolve all our problems, I think we're probably going in the wrong direction. I think we should be focused. We should have clear targets, for example, on the issue of digital taxation, on the issue of the minimum tax, or also a common understanding of what in this new world it's the alternative to physical presence. All those issues should be negotiated, should be part of that convention, but we should not expect the convention to really go into a lot of the details of what makes a good tax system. I think a lot of that lies in the hands of the countries, of the governments, of the tax administrators, of Congresses that have to pass laws. So I would be, in a way, modest about the aspiration of the convention, but effective in terms of time. And let me finish by saying that I will be, as a tax administrator or a tax authority that many of you are, I'll be a bit agnostic about which way to go. If the OECD, the MAC, the mechanisms that are available help you, use them. Use them. This is about being pragmatic, and use them to the extent that they help you in your own cause, which is basically reduce tax evasion, increase compliance, increase tax revenues. That's clearly a goal in this post-pandemic world where we have, acquired a lot of debt. Many countries are on the verge of being, in default or have distressed levels of debt. So use in an agnostic way what's available in terms of the toolkit for you to do your job and get the best results possible.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. So some recommendations there. Djamel, what would you add to that?
Well, first, just to be aligned with our colleague, first we need really to recognize some of the good results from all those frameworks. This is important to recognize. This is one. The second, we need a general umbrella where we feel we are part of something that no one can impose any solution for us. We are part of a general, what we call a more inclusive solution, really, solutions, really. And this is a framework that we will be pushing for it. This is second. I hope that third, that getting the consensus among the African countries by that submission will bring it to the higher, to call for other nations really to embrace the same path. This is very important for us to get it there. And then we are expecting, of course, the OECD that some of the issues will be again come through that one, through some groups of lobby, or I don't know, can we call it lobby or what? So it will come from the window. We will, of course, have to sit and to talk to them. But for me, I hope, and my hope that the negotiation will not weaken the framework itself, because having a very tough negotiation, I have been part of many negotiations, it really can weaken everything. It means even the best idea that you are putting on the table, going through all this kind of trying to bring the consensus will weaken everything. So I hope that building on the success of all the framework that were already, of course, reflected in the ambassador's even submission of the resolution. All those, and then even they start from the Addis Ababa Declaration up to the OECD. So everything they have recognized it. They have not said we exclude, but we want to have one general, really convention, tax convention, UN tax convention, that we feel we are part of something, and where we feel that we are mutually benefiting through a good peer review mechanism, peer review. I have to confess that having attended many of the OECD meetings, I feel that some of the African or 20 African or more than 20 African countries, they have already ratified. There is a good progress on the ground. But again, I feel that the OECD, the way that it was done, that they have taken us really by other means and by other negotiation really skills that I feel. I don't want to, by the way, disclose everything here, but this is my perception. I have spoken with my EU commissioner. We agree about the way forward. The way forward, we feel from the African Union Commission really that lay the ground for a win-win partnership, a shared really responsibility, very important for me, the shared responsibility, and shared vision. It's not, again, that we hope that enforceability of the decision and outcome and the findings will be done, because whatever we are saying, we are enumerating, we are putting a lot of numbers like $1.2 billion US, it's still there, it's not still, it has not yet still back to the African on our African books or what. So for me, again, enforceability of the decision is something that sometimes we do not discuss it, but even the decision is there. We have found, yes, but how to bring back that funds to Africa? I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Djamel. So, Mary, some recommendations acknowledging the advancement that has been made, build upon what already has been achieved, because we have to recognize the success, be modest in the aspiration of the UN Tax Convention, basically be pragmatic, don't throw the baby with the water, use what exists and what works. And also all that under the umbrella of the UN, which basically offer countries a win-win partnership, which is basically inclusive, with shared responsibilities and shared vision. What would you add to that?
Yeah, Nara, I really agree with a lot of what the other speakers have said. But firstly, on the adoption of the resolution, I think it is an opportune moment for developing countries to address some of the fundamental issues in international taxation. Because for me, and for us, I think the key words are inclusiveness and effectiveness. In terms of inclusiveness, I think I can't belabor the point, because everybody has said there was a lot of feeling that some of the countries were not able to really articulate some of their needs, and even when this happened, not all the time were these countries, heard or listened to. Then, secondly, the issue of effectiveness, and the effectiveness here, if we look at the outcomes that everybody is looking for in these negotiations, first, it is the allocation of the fair allocation of taxing rights, and two, it is a simple system that enables people to collect domestic revenue mobilization. So I think, building on what has already been discussed, a lot of work has been done. If you look at, for instance, at the BEPS project, a lot of work has been done to stop tax evasion. A lot of work has been done to, to try and protect countries' revenues, especially through the losses that are in the illicit financial flows that everybody has been talking about. So nobody can really refute that. But I think this also provides another opportunity for countries, to discuss some of the areas that they feel are pain points and that have not been addressed up to now. So my addition to what everybody has recommended is that for this, the next steps for me would be that there has to be a framework that is largely, that includes, while it includes, the intergovernmental structure that has been talked about, but also that has a clear mandate for technical expertise. So everybody to bring in, technical expertise to have, to fully resourced so that the issues are discussed in a structured manner and in a manner that then, brings in everybody and that allows for this inclusiveness and also for this effectiveness. So there's need for a clear framework that includes both the political level, but also largely the technical level. So for me, I think that would be the next steps, and that would be what would really help everybody achieve this. So there's the role of the governments, the role of organizations like the regional organizations, and all the other players that are required, to make this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for these inputs, and to all the speakers. So colleagues, participants, you have it, there you have it. So do you have any questions for the panelists, any questions, contributions that you want to basically share? We will start basically with taking maybe five input. And yes, you have the mics there. So just quickly introduce yourself, try to be as brief as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Rachel Beach, a regional tax specialist for the Arab States, UNDP. And full disclosure, I just transferred from a position at OECD. I really appreciate the different thoughts you've had on the new momentum and the new vote of the UN. My question is about some of what Mr. Cárdenas had mentioned, the momentum. And certainly, I think we can commend the OECD for bringing some real global momentum to enforce to bear as far as getting a global tax agreement. And that's a major step, which, Gabrielle and others were saying that a decade ago was almost inconceivable. What are the risks? If now there is a desire now for the UN to take this baby forward, what risk is there of losing the momentum, one, and what is needed in terms of resources, organizational, and architecture, and all of this to ensure that the UN is able to bring forces to bear to bring some global agreement forward, and not lose that momentum, and also to mitigate the risks of fragmentation of the different parts of the UN that are relevant to this, to ensure that they're working collectively on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for your questions. Next.
Good evening. My name is Chenai Mukumba, and I'm, I think, one of the 2 or 3 civil society organizations in here. I'm with Tax Justice Network Africa. First of all, thank you so much to all of the speakers. Really enjoyed this panel. I have 2 questions that I wanted to ask. The first actually links to the one that's just been previously posed. I think as civil society, that advocating for a UN tax convention is something that we've really been doing in support of the African group, as well as the group of 77 in China over the past 20 years. And so we are really excited about this new resolution that's been adopted. I was keen, I think, to hear from Director. You'd mentioned that even as we look to shifting this conversation to the UN, there's still certain dynamics that you foresee could potentially remain within the UN. And so I'd be keen to hear what you think those are and how you would encourage developing countries to address those. And then my second question is with regards to the first presentation. I think there was a point made about how, for many developing countries, even as we're having this conversation about tax rates, and I think there was reference to the Doing Business report that now obviously hasn't been put into force, but really I think still speaks to the mindset that international financial institutions have around low corporate income tax rates. And you see this whether it's the World Bank or the IMF. I'm curious to hear your thoughts around, as we're discussing multilateral approaches to tax and SDGs, how do you see the role of IFIs within this conversation, particularly in light of what you've just said, where at times they're recommending certain ways of working that may be counter to what developing countries may need in order to pursue their social objectives? Thank you.
Another question? Right here. On this side? Oh, okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Suren Pogosian, UNDP. One observation and then question coming from me to Dr. Mauricio. Actually, the complementarity of the revenue policies and expenditures is very important. And let me bring the example on the carbon topic that you mentioned as an experience coming from Colombia. In some country contexts, we see a lot of fossil fuel subsidization happening through the budget expenditure side. So for those countries, maybe the better intervention approach is to reduce the subsidization, not to introduce the carbon taxation, or maybe to have some mix of both interventions and balanced approach to it. So this is just an observation to make, to repeat the point about interconnectedness of the revenue policies and expenditure policies in relation to a specific societal target, like, for example, green transformation, et cetera, And then a question which is somehow linked but a bit wider is, Colombia that you mentioned is also quite a sort of interesting star, if I can say so, in our UNDP map on SDG finance, because in Colombia, Minister of Finance recently adopted the SDG budget tagging, which was very illustrative. I'm not saying it's the first country. There are a few other countries who did it before, but it's a very interesting case how the budget expenditures can be presented by individual 169 SDG indicators, so targets. So this is one aspect that UNDP brought into the country. So together with UNDP, Minister of Finance introduced it, but it was done sort of, if I can say so, bottom up. It was technical solution, discussed with technical people, implemented, and then it got some higher level attention. And so my question to you is, what is, in your practical experience, the sort of steps in a sentence or two, as a former minister, what will be the right way, and bringing your example, to start that kind of interconnected approaches between revenues and expenditure side, bottom up or top down? And just to illustrate the one bottom up example, famous example with Yellow Jackets from France, where the solution on green budgeting in France came after this huge movement from the bottom that actually sparked this demand to do this. So the question is about top-down versus bottom-up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last question for this round. Yes. Please try to be as brief as possible.
Yeah. Are we close politically on all this conversation? Have we got the moment that a version of what used to be called the Tobin tax is ready? On your big ideas, Mauricio. Because for me, that is one, if you look at the word today, the kind of money that gets in and out so fast of our countries and what it does, so are we ready to start having them back to have a serious conversation about a Tobin tax, type of Tobin tax?
Thank you very much. So we'll stop the questions there for the first round. So I'll start first with you, Mary, if that's okay with you, to address the questions of how do we ensure that we do not lose the momentum that we have so far, and what is the questions was already partially answered previously, but what do you think is needed to ensure that the UN brings about that global tax governance and avoid the fragmentation within the UN? And then I will also invite Djamel to basically address the questions of the issues of the dynamic issues that can actually present itself at the UN level, and then we'll finish with Mauricio to address the 3 questions addressed to him, if that's okay. Mary, we start with you. So try to be as brief as possible to see if we can take an additional question or 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Nara, and I think those were very good questions and very interesting. In terms of the momentum, I think everybody acknowledges the fact that these discussions have been intense, and they have covered a lot of work. A lot of work has been discussed, for instance, under the 2 pillars, the pillar 1 and the pillar 2. And developing countries and developed countries have all articulated what they feel is best for them. I think at this level, it wouldn't be practical to drop everything and say we are starting afresh. No, I think the way I look at it is that what this new dispensation should look at is to say, what are the points of congruence, or what are the points where countries expressed concern and were not happy with the outcome, and can we look at that, and what are the areas that some of the countries, for instance, feel were ignored? Because, for instance, if you look at under the discussions, especially on the issues of tax certainty, were those covered? Were those sufficiently covered? Were the countries happy in terms of the allocation of taxing rights? The different thresholds that came out of the discussion, do those apply to countries? If these only apply to, say, for instance, 100 MNEs, maybe most of those don't. The developing countries don't relate to those situations. So for me, that should be the point. Where everybody should start to look at that and say, this has been agreed on. What has been agreed on, we leave. What hasn't been agreed on, we open for discussion. So for me, I see that, as a starting point, and therefore that way we wouldn't be able to lose those gains, and everybody will be able to articulate their position. Yeah, so that would be my response to that, Nara.
Mary, for that. So basically building on what, focusing on what has not been agreed upon to expand on. So Djamel, what are those issues, those dynamic issues that we need to avoid repeating at the UN level?
Thank you. I think the first thing that I'd like really to re-emphasize is inclusiveness. This is very important, that all the party will be there, and we will, of course, put everything on the table. It's we are not trying really to hijack, or this is one. So for me, trust and transparency are, of course, something guiding principle of whatever round of negotiation that will be starting soon. So this is at the technical level. We have noticed that all the framework that were put in place were done on a bilateral level between OECD and selected countries that, of course, have decided to join the OECD, either the OECD or other framework. Not just, but the OECD is something that we are not saying that they should not. This is a sovereign decision. They have decided to join. There are benefits. We see some of the disadvantage are sitting there. So what we are trying to do is to tell, look, we need to sit as African, discuss, exchange, and having a common position to move forward toward the OECD and the UN/UN. Now you have a new arena, a new platform, new global platform, UN. So for me, something very important to take stock of what has happened on the ground, take stock of what are the success story, take stock of the lessons learned, especially when it comes to the disadvantage that we have been, of course, something which was designed somewhere, and you bring everybody to tell them, well, you have to be part of that one. Otherwise, if you do not comply, you are blacklisted. I don't want to mention this here, but there are countries that are blacklisted, which I feel we do not have to be blacklisted. We do not have to, because first because we are lacking capacity. And this is something very, for example, do you know that exchange of information, only 3 countries are participating, 90% of the information are provided by 3 countries in Africa, which means that there is an issue because of the information. It's not available. Nobody can assure that this information is the accurate one. And the fact that we found that 3 of them are targeted, it means there is something behind. And again, I don't want to explain everything or disclose here, but we have our own view, and we believe that bringing OECD, again, whatever is working, and we are not saying that this will supersede, but this will be a general framework of cooperation. Of course, OECD, whatever framework, whatever is there existing, will be part of it. Again, I mentioned that in that resolution, everything was listed. None of the framework was excluded, by the way. Even the G20 was there. So for me, all the key players are there, and we know these key players. They are very strong. It's not, we are not, I'm not talking about, we African, I know that I'm sitting in front of a giant and Goliath, if you want to name it, but we know them. And we know where we are. But something which is very important, common position will be adopted. This is one. We have our, of course, organs. We have we have different organs, but we have a layer which is very important, is the Ministerial Conference of Finance, where decisions are taken there. And of course, once the decision is taken, we'll take it up to the leaders, to the president, the heads of state, and the government summit. So we have our own what we call deliberation organs that we will go through. But before going to that, we need to sit, have a joint committee with OECD, discuss in a very transparent manner, putting all the issues on the table, bringing issues that perhaps some countries they were not even perhaps able to put on the table. We will put it, or we will put it on their behalf. We have issues here, and something that is very important, we have noticed there is a very huge issue of lack of capacity at the national level, really, that makes some countries very weak in terms of providing information as per the request, especially when it comes to the automated exchange of information or the exchange. There are two ways to we have issues. There are countries that they have been able to do it very, very efficiently. It's Tunisia, but there are others that are really lagging behind. And I don't want that, because they have lack of capacity, to blacklist them. So this is an issue for me as an African representative sitting here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Djamel. Mauritius. Mauricio, you have 2 minutes to help us keep time. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'll try to be brief. Not losing momentum, Rachel's question. I think that's a risk. And first, we have to acknowledge that there is that risk, because we can fall in a certain false complacency that the approval of the resolution calling for a convention is a success in itself. It is not. It is a means to an end. But real success is the end. It's having the convention. I think if you listen carefully to the conversation today, there's, you could get the feeling that there is kind of like this tension between the UN and the OECD, the UN versus the OECD. No, I think this has to be the UN plus the OECD. It's the only way in which we can actually build from what has been achieved so far. Why I say plus? Because the OECD, has the teams, has the information, has had the history of the views, the positions of the various countries, characterizing the OECD as an institution that was captured by the multilateral, the multinational corporations. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. I think we have to understand a bit better the politics within the OECD. So I would say, build on that. Build on what has been done. It's not starting from scratch. That would be my view. I have to tell you this. I was the coordinator of Colombia's accession to the OECD. We succeeded. We are now members of the OECD. But in the process of doing that, we learned a lot, and we improved a lot in many various different areas of public policy. I mean, not just on tax issues, but also on in many different fronts of the way a government is actually run. So that's my point on the idea of not losing the momentum. I'm going to migrate here because I have very limited time, but bottom up or top down on this conversation about especially SDGs and the implementation. Colombia, by the way, was also very involved in the initial conceptual stages of the SDGs, and it incorporated the SDGs as part of Colombia's own development plan. So that's an important aspect. Also, this was regionalized. So we had SDGs, goals, targets at the regional level. My point on your very good question is, look, the world today is very different from where it was in 2015. We're in a world where we had a pandemic, where countries have, I already mentioned this, a lot of debt, public debt to GDP was increased globally by about 10 percentage points. This means that there is now, and this is a word that many people that advocate for SDGs try to avoid, there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs. Maybe we cannot achieve everything. And if there is anything that a minister, or in my case, a former minister of finance, knows, is that there's always a conversation about we can do this, but we cannot do that. And I think the sooner we start a conversation about what's realistic, what are the priorities, what's non-negotiable, where we have to put all the emphasis, especially when countries begin talking about fiscal consolidation, because that's going to happen. So this is a little bit top-down in the sense there are limited resources and there's so much that we can do. Unfortunately, contrary to a lot of the perceived wisdom about these things, there will be trade-offs. We won't necessarily achieve everything, but I prefer acknowledging that now rather than waiting until 2030 and say, oh, we missed this. We missed this target. We didn't achieve this. We didn't achieve that. I think it's better to say, well, these are the priorities. The pandemic, and especially the scarring effects of the pandemic, left us with this homework. We need to improve education. That should be the priority. We need to make sure that we reduce issues of informality. A number of issues that were exacerbated during the pandemic. In my view, there should be the priorities. And a final word about the Tobin tax. So I mentioned the need of funding global public goods. Global public goods is what's going to help us deal with the next pandemic. It's what's going to help us deal with climate change. But we don't have the capacity to pay for the global public goods. Just to give you a number, a figure, the total ODA budget, if you add all the countries in the world, all they provide in aid is $100 billion per year. $100 billion per year. The lowest estimates of what the global public goods will cost are in the order of trillions of dollars. So that means there is a gap here, and it's not going to be covered by aid money, by the budgets. I mean, in the advanced economies, there is a line item in the budget that it's aid. That's not enough to provide the global public goods. So we need to think about these global taxes. I didn't use the word Tobin taxes, but you very clearly mentioned it because it's one of the options that has been actually put forward in terms of funding these global public goods. It's not just that option. You could think in terms of the digital taxes as taxes that fund global public goods. There have been efforts in the past, they didn't go very far, on aviation taxes. There are a number of things that can be, but we need to think about this. Because this is the new normal, I think. This the new generation of crises, and these are crises that are truly, truly global. And there's a limited amount of things we can do at the national level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the conversation will continue over dinner, tea, and coffee. Thank you very much for your questions, and please join me in appreciating our very credited panelists. Djamel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nara, Mauricio, Djamel, and thank you so much, Mary. It's midnight in Pretoria. Thank you for joining us from Pretoria. It was a long day, exciting day. I guess you all would have found a lot of discussions very exciting. It was very fast-moving discussions. We heard many different things, starting from the need for shared understanding, to having a framework, to the need for evidence-based tax policies, to what is the need for multilateralism and where multilateralism can go from here on. A lot of colleagues have reached out for presentations. We'll be sharing the presentations after the event, and we will also be structuring some of the dialogues that we had here and sharing the videos also, so that there is a continued engagement and learning from what we heard today, because we all imagine that it's a lot to process in one day, moving right from basics of taxation to multilateralism. When we come back tomorrow, we'll have more thematic discussions on thematic areas like environment, gender, human rights, and inclusion. The good news tomorrow is it's going to be much more sunny, no rain, but it's going to be cold also tomorrow. So please be prepared. The other good news is that we are also going to have a reception in the evening at 5, and that's just across the road from here on. That's for today. As you all know, we have the interpretation services available, so you can also ask these questions tomorrow in all the languages, 6 languages that we have here. You can leave your interpretation devices on the table that we have there. For now, on that note, thank you so much. I know a lot of you are already jet-lagged, so wishing you a good night, and see you all tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bye.